phone. Let's bring in our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, now. So, Sam, a big political moment, the resignation of the Deputy Prime Minister.
That's right. And it's quite something to think, Anna, that 48 hours ago, it was Dominic Raab sitting next to Rishi Sunak at Prime Minister's questions. That was a moment seen as a symbol, a signal by many about how close the Deputy Prime Minister was to the PM and how hard it would be in the event that the report that we kind of all knew was coming probably the next day, that how hard it would be to let him go. And all the way through yesterday, clearly Downing Street having to weigh up what were quite difficult judgments, because it was absolutely clear from the delay, and the Prime Minister got the report basically 24 hours ago now, it was quite clear that what the report didn't do was provide an absolute smoking gun that would result in the automatic and immediate dismissal of the Deputy Prime Minister. There was stuff to weigh up. We were told that this was a lengthy document, that it was very detailed. It had taken 5 months to assemble. There were multiple complaints that had to be adjudicated on. But there was a sense that while we had been guided that we might get a pretty quick decision from the Prime Minister, it was, in the event, rather harder than that. Dominic Raab chooses to make a lot in his letter of the fact that really only 2 complaints were upheld and the rest were dismissed. Knowing that there were 2 complaints upheld, and if we do get the Adam Tolley report in full, we'll be able to see the details. And I still think the plan is that we see it. So when it comes, we'll be bringing you, putting it on that screen and going through it line by line. It'll be interesting to see just how bad the behaviour was, how bad Adam Tolley judged what Dominic Raab did. And we'll be able to judge for ourselves whether or not there was a realistic case for keeping him. Clearly, at points yesterday, Downing Street must have considered whether there was a path to keeping him. That's why it would have taken so long. But here we are today with the announcement of the resignation. Although it's called a resignation, when you read the letter, it doesn't feel like Dominic Raab is in any way happy with the situation, with the outcome, whilst acknowledging the upheld complaints. He says that the bar for a bullying complaint is effectively too high, and says that that's bad for government, bad for society to be set so high. So I suppose I'm questioning whether his resignation letter really was a resignation, or whether he basically jumped because he knew that he would have to be pushed by the Prime Minister. And that kind of slightly bitter tone, rather reminiscent of the slightly bitter tone in the Nadhim Zahawi letter, I think will shine through and spark a debate. And that's probably the politest word that we're going to use. But there's going to be a debate now amongst some of the allies that we've been hearing on Sky News for days inside the Conservative Party, who think that Dominic Raab was the victim of a politically motivated witch hunt from potentially members of the civil service, younger members of the civil service who didn't like his politics and weaponised an HR system in order to get him out of the jobs because they didn't like what they were hearing. Now, the question is Rishi Sunak able to contain that debate, cauterise that debate, close that debate down with this resignation, or are there some people angry about what's happened here, angry that they will see the civil service having fought and pushed a deputy prime minister who at one point stood in for the prime minister when Boris Johnson was very ill? It's harder to push that out. But ultimately, when you think of the calculation for Rishi Sunak, we now understand it a little bit better as a result of that letter from Dominic Raab. Rishi Sunak was facing the possibility, if he wanted to keep Dominic Raab in that job, he was going to have to explain why there had been 2 bullying complaints, harassment complaints upheld against his Deputy Prime Minister, but effectively was still willing to keep him in the job when he promised on the steps of Downing Street about accountability and responsibility and respect and returning those sorts of values to the heart of government when he came in. He would have had to done that and face down the possibility of perhaps victims of Dominic Raab's behaviour going public, senior civil servants who perhaps are no longer in the civil service being prepared to give interviews and talk about what they experienced while working alongside him. I think there was a lot that Rishi Sunak was going to have to face down in order to keep Dominic Raab in his job. So perhaps that little, that slight tone of anger, that tone of bitterness, is somewhat ironic given this is all a discussion, it would seem, about a lot of it about Dominic Raab's temper, some of that perhaps just sparkling and surfacing through in the way that letter is written. I think it was probably just quite hard in the face of perhaps a sustained media appearance from critics, people who witnessed firsthand and the fact that there were 2 complaints upheld. And although Dominic Raab may say the majority of them are dismissed, in some senses, that there was a finding that there was bullying in 2 cases, and that is enough. And I think in a lot of workplaces that would be judged to be enough. But the question is, do the Conservative backbenches agree? Now, Rishi Sunak is lucky that this didn't land 4 months ago or 3 months ago. This is a report that's taken 5 months in the making, because the political conditions for Rishi Sunak were very, very different back in January, February. His position much less secure. However, in the last couple of months, we've seen Rishi Sunak's fundamental political position improved dramatically after the success of the Windsor Framework domestically, after some of those foreign trips where he stood alongside Joe Biden in San Diego, making a bit of a mark on the world stage, bringing together the Conservative Party back in Westminster, even doing something of a deal around small boats with Tory rebels just 36 hours ago. All of that probably means that although there will be sympathisers of Dominic Raab, there will be people who feel that he's hard done by, people, perhaps those who came out on the airwaves, on Sky News yesterday, the day before, saying that they hadn't seen Dominic Raab bully, they thought he treated everybody with respect, that actually the internal criticism for this decision is relatively minimal. I know people around Dominic Raab, now some of them in the last 24 hours have been briefing pretty bullishly, talking about him being lawyered up, even though the law doesn't really feature in this process, talking about a fight to the death that he was prepared to make. Again, perhaps an unfortunate analogy in the context of what we're really talking about. But I do know other people who are around Dominic Raab who, for some weeks, have effectively, to me, been acknowledging that a positive outcome for the Deputy Prime Minister was highly unlikely, and that he was almost certainly going to have to fall on his sword as a result of the cumulative nature of the complaints and the stories, some of which we've heard in the media. And no doubt when we get that document shortly, we'll be able to peel through it line by line. We'll get the full cast of it. But there is something, it's got to be honest, of a national conversation going on at the moment about exactly the things that Dominic Raab talks about in his letter. There is, particularly in the light of the dismissal of the former head of the CBI, Tony Danker, there's a discussion about how one person's workplace etiquette, standards, culture, the way they talk to other people, the standards that they demand might be acceptable, but another person might not find that acceptable. And I think it's quite interesting that Dominic Raab leans into that discussion, which will no doubt feature in our politics in the days to come, as people try and get to grips with people from sometimes different generations, but not always, setting different standards, approaching issues different ways, being more sensitive than others. And there will be some in the Tory party who will be tempted to say that what's happened here is the derogatory term for Whitehall used by some Tory MPs, which is the blob, has won this time by serving up a chorus of complaints about the Deputy Prime Minister, a figure that intrinsically they didn't like. And that the Prime Minister has given in to that. And that's the issue here. So I think that there is a discussion to be had politically where people try to minimise the political fallout. But in the end, Rishi Sunak must have decided that even if Dominic Raab looks like he resigned, although he looks like he didn't want to resign from the letter in which he announced his resignation, I think Rishi Sunak will have decided that the pain of keeping him outweighed whatever the potential benefits were for impressing perhaps one flank of his party and effectively standing by his Deputy Prime Minister. It has to be said, people's political careers are judged by the public in the round, and this will obviously be a very important part of his record, as will be the standing in for Boris Johnson when Boris Johnson had COVID. But of course, one of the things that might have made it easier to wave goodbye to Dominic Raab today were the circumstances in which he departed from the Foreign Office in 2021. They weren't pretty. You'll remember in that summer there was the evacuation of Afghanistan, NATO pulling out of Afghanistan, the US and the UK as well. And I think in that period, Dominic Raab was on holiday. Dominic Raab didn't go back to the Foreign Office, oversee in person, and ultimately Boris Johnson decided to demote him. Now you can see on your screens that we do have the letter from Dominic Raab. That's the one where you do see the sort of just that slight sense of bitterness and anger coming out. Just to read some of it that you can see on the screen, he talks about he feels duty-bound to accept the outcome of the inquiry. By the way, viewers of Sky News will know that he made the pledge to resign if there was an accusation of bullying to Sophie Ridge on Sunday. So he had committed publicly to resign if there were allegations of bullying that were upheld in this inquiry. And if you look at paragraph 3 on your screen, it says, the report did dismiss all but 2 of the claims levelled against me. I also believe that its 2 adverse findings are flawed and set a dangerous precedent for the conduct of good government. Now, what that means is that the next question for Rishi Sunak is, does he believe that the eminent KC, who spent 5 months doing a report into Dominic Raab's behaviour, issued flawed judgments? That's quite an incredible attack line from Dominic Raab, who, of course, himself is a lawyer. Quite an incredible attack line against Tolley and the report that he's spent 5 months producing. Tolley is a man of some standing in the legal profession. It'd be interesting to see whether he agrees with Dominic Raab. Interesting to see whether Rishi Sunak agrees with Dominic Raab, who levels quite an aggressive accusation about adverse findings, which are flawed in his language, and a dangerous precedent for the conduct of good government. Well, there are people that disagree with that. There are people in private who do talk about how it was difficult working with Dominic Raab. There are senior civil servants who wouldn't let junior staff alone with Dominic Raab, according to reports certainly that I've heard. Dominic Raab still in this letter insisting that he does sort of behave professionally at all times. Although it's an interesting letter because in many ways it suggests that he both accepts and doesn't accept the findings simultaneously, which is why this all throws up. But the fact that he's resigned probably minimises some of the pressure on the Prime Minister, but it'll be interesting to see quite how he, the Prime Minister, answers the challenges and the questions posed by Rishi Sunak's, by Dominic Raab's letter there. Now, the letter goes on, ministers must be able to exercise direct oversight with respect to senior officials over critical negotiations conducted on behalf of the British people. Otherwise, the democratic and constitutional principle of ministerial responsibility will be lost. And that is how Dominic Raab frames the way that he conducted himself in government. And of course, there are other accounts of how he behaved, infamous examples from 2018, where he was appointed Brexit Secretary, suddenly turned up in Brussels to the consternation of the negotiating group. Not clear what gains he made, but there are in Whitehall memories of moments like that where some believe that there wasn't good behaviour. Now, in this letter, what's interesting is Dominic Raab goes on to attack those people who, quote unquote, leaked those episodes. Now, he basically says it is unacceptable for members of Whitehall, members of the civil service, to effectively talk about his behaviour. He thinks it is a bad thing that the media got hold of accounts of his behaviour, which he contests, and thinks that that's unacceptable. But what's interesting about this is that really we wouldn't be where we are today without the reporting, not just on Sky News, but on The Guardian and other media outlets, which brought to light in quite stark terms the fact that there have been formal complaints. It was the media coverage that resulted in Dominic Raab having to ask for an inquiry into himself by the Prime Minister, ultimately done by Adam Tolley back last November. So I suppose in one sense, yes, Dominic Raab can regret the fact that civil service or proxies for the civil servants or representatives of the civil servants, we won't know who, did reveal details of Dominic Raab's behaviour. But however much he might regret it, the truth is he would probably still be Deputy Prime Minister today if that wasn't the case. So an attack on leaking, an attack on the standards that he thinks should be maintained in the workplace. But according to the accounts that I've heard, there have been quite difficult episodes. Some people might characterise it as controlling. He would say that it was only exacting standards. The sort of general theme that I think that when you talk to a lot of people that have worked with Dominic Raab that does surface quite repeatedly is he very much was a politician who liked doing things in a very specific way to quite a fine degree. He liked exacting ways for documents to be prepared. He was very hot on timings. He was very hot on presentation. He was very hot on how he was treated. Now, he will argue that was appropriate for a senior minister who's trying to run a government department to behave. Others clearly disagreed, and we await the details of the two cases of conduct that Adam Tolley, the KC, believes were inappropriate, and that's the that really is at the nub of this letter and the reason why Dominic Raab has said he's going to resign. And that he has accepted his fate and done what he promised to Sophie Ridge that he would do a few weeks ago and resign if that report found that there was bullying.
Okay.
But Westminster never stands still. And so you can see the door of Downing Street there. I'd expect some activity a little bit later today with perhaps a new replacement as Justice Secretary. And then there's a decision for the Prime Minister as well, whether or not he does a like-for-like replacement of the Deputy Prime Minister job, because that's a title that comes and goes in British politics. Dominic Raab was initially, at the point that Boris Johnson came in, given the title of First Minister of State.
Okay.
And then when Boris Johnson demoted him in 2021 from the Foreign Office to the Justice Department, he gave him the Deputy Prime Minister job as a consolation. Will that job title be handed out today, or might it just disappear for a little bit? That we should find out a little bit later.